My father, he had gone to Harvard and MIT. I had no interest in college. I barely escaped high school. I was very undirected. My father became the world's career counselor.
The book written by your father, late Mr. Richard Bolles, was written a book called What Color is Your Parachute? What kind of pressure that you saw on your father, his son who is directionless? Did you ever have a conversation which is not so pleasant?
My father and I had what I would say would be a complicated relationship. I said, if you were my age, what would you be doing? And he just gave it a beat and he said, more. So in the movies, what would happen is then that young, stupid person would suddenly have a light bulb go off. Oh, I'm going to do more with my life and go running out of there and get his act together. And no, that didn't happen. I was still rudderless for another 4 or 5 years. And so now this personal computer thing had come along, and I found out I really loved it. Got to move to Silicon Valley. Microsoft was already a big company and IBM was a big company. Now I had my context. Now I knew the kind of environment that I thrived in.
We tend to overestimate our education and not learning.
So learning becomes a mindset. It becomes a process. And we have unfortunately just leached out this love of learning with this industrial era model because we thought that was the key to success in work. There's nothing wrong with a fixed mindset, except when the world of exponential change goes through a shift. We have to be more intentional, not less, in an era of exponential change.
Thank you so much, Gary. Such a pleasure having you here on the show, X Monks Drive.
No, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Looking forward. I think the color of the day is blue. I was not expecting you to wear blue as well. So the first thing that caught my attention is the color blue.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Gary, while going through the kind of work that you have done, the first thought that came to my mind is that I should be your apprentice. I should actually walk around with you throughout the world, just scanning your laptop and just be a fly on the wall. Because I'm very sure the kind of learning that I'm going to extract just by your sheer presence, that would be phenomenal for me.
Well, I appreciate that. I hope it wouldn't work out like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. The myth of that didn't go too well. So, but no, in this case, no. I'm looking forward to learning from you as well. So, no, that's it'll be a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Gary. Something that fascinated me was the book written by your father, late Mr. Richard Bolles, who has written a book called What Color is Your Parachute? And very curious, what kind of conversations did you used to have with your father while you were growing up? Would love to understand that.
Oh, excellent question. My father was a small town minister in New Jersey in the United States, and he was called when I was 9 years old to San Francisco to a huge cathedral that was pretty new, and to become sort of a minister for the people. And so our family drove across the United States, and he was a minister there for several years, and then he was sort of caught in a budget crunch. The cathedral started to have less money, and so he was written out of the budget, and so he suddenly found himself unemployed in his 40s with 4 children and a wife in a reasonably expensive city. And it took him a little while to find a job, but he eventually found a job helping other ministers who were on college campuses. And this is in the late 1960s. And during that time, there were problems with drugs and young people, so he first helped the ministers with that problem, and then they were getting laid off themselves because budgets were being cut back. And so he thought, I have to help them. I have to help those ministers. And he got a grant, and he spent a year trying to understand the best job hunting techniques because he had had such a hard time. And he ended up writing a book just for ministers. And so we had many conversations when I was a teenager. My parents had split up during that time, but we would have conversations about why was he so fascinated by this job hunting thing. He moved into a little apartment on his own that I would go visit him on weekends. And And he self-published this book, and I would carry these stacks of books down to the post office with him, and I would say, Dad, this book is for ministers. Why does it have corporations and the Department of Labor? And why are these people ordering a
Mhm.
book for ministers? And he said,
Mm.
I don't know. And of course there was no email at the time. So he wrote them, and they wrote back and they said, well, this is the best review of good job hunting techniques. There's no other book like this. And he said, okay, market opportunity. Found a small publisher, rewrote it for all of us. This was when I was 17 years old, and then it became this book called "What Color Is Your Parachute?" But his agreement with his publisher was that he could update it every year. And so he is one of his favorite jokes was that he'd written 42 different books. They just all had the same title, because for 42 years in a row he updated the book, always with the latest techniques. And so when you talk about conversations with my father, so some fathers and sons, work well together. I ended up not being very interested in college. My early youth, I was very undirected. My father became the world's career counselor, so of course, no pressure. But one of the odd jobs I ended up doing is I ended up sort of falling into the family business. So by the time I was 19 years old, I ended up becoming a staff member on his workshop team, and I was trained how to do career counseling with people in their 40s and 50s. So I say this all the time to young people. I said, imagine at the age of 19, you're listening to all these people that are older, and you think adults are supposed to have their act together. And then you hear from one after another, like, oh, no, they're having some real career problems. They've been in the same dead end job for 10 to 20 years. What else would you learn from that process but to do what you love? Like, that's it. That's it. These people have been, not doing what they love, and then you help them with a process so that they can figure that out. And it doesn't mean everything's perfect, and it doesn't even mean that you feel like it's your deep purpose in the world. It's just something that resonates with you more than the work you have been doing. So that was a great learning for me, and that was often a lot of conversations I had with my father at the time, which is, how can we best help these people
Yeah,
that are going through these pivot points?
yeah. You mentioned that at one point in time you were directionless, and then came a time when you were busy listening to these conversations of people who are in their mid 40s and trying to figure out the direction for themselves. At the same time, you also mentioned that how dad was doing something that's helping people to find a job for themselves. Now, help me understand what kind of pressure that you saw on your father, because on one hand he's helping others to find a right job for themselves, and here he has his son who, according to you, is directionless. Did you ever have a conversation which is not so pleasant?
That's wonderful. So no, I appreciate this. This is a fun line because I tell these stories to young people all the time. In my book, The Next Rules of Work, I show waves of the rules of work. There's this sort of old industrial era, and then there's these next rules, like all these things we're co-creating. And what happens a lot when we're older, we've learned those old rules, and we think, well, then we're going to try to teach those to young people. Well, no, they want to have the next rules. They want to sort of figure out, what the
Precisely.
world should look like and how it should operate. So what was different for us was that my father, he learned and figured out and developed all these amazing techniques for figuring out what you want to do with your life. But he had gone to Harvard and MIT. My mother went to what became a women's university, became part of Harvard, so very well schooled. I had no interest in college. I barely escaped high school. And so my father and I had what I would say would be a somewhat complicated relationship. Here I'm his son, but I'm also working for him, but I'm also, sort of doing other jobs and not really all that directed. And so, so when I was 20, after I'd been working with him for a little while, I could feel, I wouldn't call it disapproval, but I'd say, well, maybe it was disapproval. Who knows?
Hmm.
I'm not going to speak for him. I could feel like, he's got an opinion. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And so, and being young and stupid, I wanted him to voice that disapproval, right? So, so I kept
Hmm.
asking him, and he never answered me. And finally,
Hmm.
very memorably, and I can still visualize, sitting out at his the patio of his place out in Walnut Creek, east of San Francisco. And I finally found the question. I said, if you were my age,
mm,
what would you be doing?
mm,
And he just gave it a beat and he said, more.
mm. Wow.
So that's pressure in that. Yeah, he's got an opinion. He's not going
Mm,
to tell me really what the opinion is.
yeah.
It's just, yeah, go do more with your life, right? And
Mm,
so
mm,
when I tell that story to young people, so in the movies,
mm.
what would happen is then that young stupid person would suddenly have a light bulb go off. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
going to do more with my life, and go running out of there
Yeah.
and get his act together. And no, that didn't happen. I was still rudderless for another 4 or 5 years, but
Mm,
I was very lucky
mm.
because I was doing all these odd jobs, especially temporary jobs in offices. I had learned how to type in high school on a real typewriter. And so now this computer thing, this personal computer thing had come along,
Mm.
and I found out I really loved it. Like I
Yeah.
really enjoyed it. I would go to a temporary agency and I'd say, "What's the hardest job with computers that you've got?" And they'd
Mm,
say, "Here's a small business. They've got a computer. They don't know how to use it." And at the time, there were all these different kinds of small
mm,
computers. And so I
mm,
would go into the office and I'd say, "Why don't you pay me for a couple of days? I'll read the manuals of these computers, and in the afternoon, I'll teach you how to use them."
mm.
And so I eventually decided, hey, you know what? Got to move to Silicon Valley. Wasn't that far, but Microsoft was already a big company, and
Yeah.
IBM was a big company. I thought, oh, we've already done everything you can do with computers, but I'll give it a try.
Yeah.
And this will date me, but it was early 1980s,
Mm.
and it turned out to be this new wave of computer networks that I got in
Precisely.
on the front end of. So that's, and then from that point on,
Yeah.
now I had my context. Now I
Yeah.
knew the kind of environment that I thrived in.
This is so fascinating that we tend to overestimate our education and not learning. Would love to understand
Absolutely.
your version of learning. We tend to overestimate education and underestimate the context that we are born into, because that context is planting a lot of seeds in us that's going to play a very vital role in.
So I think that's a great insight. So first off, because I don't have enough college to stuff into a thimble.
Hmm.
I either have zero moral authority to talk about how we should reinvent education, or I
Yeah.
have complete moral authority because I didn't go through the standard route, and
Yeah.
therefore
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
talk from the outside. And so my answer is, the reason I talk about the future of learning
Hmm.
and not the future of education is that, and I don't want to upset anybody that thinks, no, every person in the world needs an education. What
Hmm.
I say instead is, everybody needs the body of
Learning.
learning and the
Yeah.
process of learning that
Hmm.
teaches them a love of learning
Hmm.
and a learning mindset,
Hmm.
so that they will continue to learn throughout their lives.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
if that
Hmm.
happens in traditional education, awesome.
Yeah.
But not everybody is optimized for that system. That's a system that's, in a lot of countries around the world,
Hmm.
built on an industrial era model.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't think we need to work like factories anymore.
Precisely. Let me ask a very basic question, and I'm sure you would have heard this question some zillion times. How do you define learning?
I'm going to answer that a couple of different ways. So I
Hmm.
have 10 courses on LinkedIn Learning with about 1.3 million learners.
Wow.
So I've been exposed to, and I see a lot of the flow of, the people that take the different courses and
Hmm.
the questions and their thoughts and that sort of thing. So it just gives me a, really good, and it's very, very global. And quite a number from India. There's a couple of ways I answer that are based on context, right?
Hmm.
And I'll give you one context that I find seems to resonate with audiences a lot.
Hmm.
So my father, after he wrote "What Color Is Your Parachute," he started to see these patterns, and he said, "Wait a minute, sure, work matters, but I actually see these sort of three different phases of our lives. I
Hmm.
see us having to get a whole bunch of information, learning at the beginning of
Yeah.
our lives. We call
Yeah.
that education. And then we have a whole bunch of work. And then we have a little bit of leisure in what I call the period formerly known as retirement." And
Hmm.
so my father wrote a book in 1976 called "The Three Boxes of Life and
Hmm.
How to Get Out of Them." And he coined the phrase lifelong learning,
Hmm.
lifelong working, and lifelong leisure. And
Hmm.
So the whole idea was that if you turn it on its side and you are intentional
mm,
about continuous learning throughout your life,
mm,
that changes context. It goes from a traditional learning environment,
mm.
which we call pre, in the US, pre-K,
It's
K
like
through 8.
outside in.
So exactly where this industrial era model is designed basically for infusion. Like we're going to infuse into your head a bunch of
Yeah,
facts,
yeah,
and then
yeah.
you're going to use that in the second box, and then whatever's left over in terms of your energy at the
Yeah.
in the final phase of your life. Oh, we'll call that leisure, and that's retirement, or
Mm,
whatever, whatever you can do.
yeah.
So what I do is I show this as a model for young people nowadays. And I
Mm,
say, so
mm,
so those three boxes
yeah.
are still followed, the old rules of work and of life in many
Mm,
countries. But young people today are completely resetting that model. They
yeah.
come out of high school, vocational school, college, and they're still learning online. They get a day job, but then they're driving for Uber at night and they're working on a startup with their friends. And so I show this pastiche of work and learning and leisure. They
Mm,
take a gap month with their friends and they go traveling around India. It's this intentional
mm,
unbundling of that three boxes model.
yeah.
And so learning becomes a mindset. It becomes a process.
Beautiful.
And we have unfortunately just
Mm,
leached out this love of learning with
mm,
this industrial era model as early as we possibly can, because we thought that was the key to success in work. If you just follow the rules, if we just shove some facts in your head,
mm.
you can amortize that investment throughout your work life in your vocation or your profession.
Beautiful.
And that world doesn't really exist in too many parts of the
Yeah.
world anymore.
Wow. I think the last 7 minutes was a masterclass on what's a learning and what difference can you find in people of the past and people who are running right now. How do they look at these three boxes? And let me just
Yeah.
rework on that. These
Yeah.
three parallel threads, the learning thread, the working thread, and the leisure thread. Now, help me understand, in my limited experience, Gary, every time when I come across people, I am curious, very, very fascinated. There are people who are so kicked about learning. They are so full of curiosity. This friend of mine, her name is Pat Headley, based out of US. I said, what's the one word that you would like to share that's the most important word for an individual to grow? She said, curiosity. I said,
Yeah.
wow. And she must be in her 60s. So, on one hand, there are people with so much of experience and wealth, they continue to follow curiosity and learning. At the same time, there are
Yeah.
people that I've come across in their 40s. And if you ask them, hey, what's the new course that you are attending? What's the new thing that you are learning? He said, why do I need to learn? I'm working, the job is going really
Yeah.
well. Now, what do
Yeah.
you think? What's the difference in the mindset of these two people?
Uh,
And how does that impact an individual's trajectory, the career
Great.
trajectory, of course?
Yeah. Great question. So the two most popular courses that I have on LinkedIn are learning mindset
Hmm.
and learning agility. So the
Beautiful.
learning mindset I would separate out for the two use cases that you just
Mm,
talked about. So parents ask me all the time, how will my kid be successful in a world of exponential change? And I say,
mm,
well, I sort of don't think too much about success because I think that's your model, you know,
mm,
parents' model. But I say, look, if you have a young person, a young human that is curious about anything, I don't
mm,
care whether it's bugs or dinosaurs or bows but wants to dive in deeply,
mm,
feed that capacity, and that's curiosity and that's
mm,
fascination and then it'll shift, it'll change to something else, and
mm,
feed that as well, because again, often our school systems are designed to leach that out, not to help us to become more curious or
mm,
more fascinated.
mm,
It's to sort of follow a set of rules in the context of one particular kind of learning. And so the differences between those people, what I often say is, what one of the framings I'm sure you talk about is, Dr. Carol Dweck has a great book called Mindset, which I
mm,
refer to all the time. And she reflects exactly what you were just talking about. Is there is a growth mindset, which is continually being curious, continually finding new things that draw you. I often call that a North Star or a Southern Cross, something that
mm,
you just have to continually
mm,
directionally go towards. But she also talks about a fixed mindset. And what I often say is, look, there's nothing wrong with a fixed mindset. That person who
mm,
says, look, I'm not learning anything right now, I wouldn't criticize them,
mm,
except when the world of exponential change goes through a shift. And so if
mm,
you had a mind-numbing commute and you went to a cubicle farm to work, and along comes a pandemic, and suddenly you can't do those things.
mm,
If you have a fixed mindset, you're like the ant that suddenly has a leaf fall in front of them and they can't keep going. It's like, what do I do now?
mm,
Um, but so a growth mindset driven by curiosity, pulled by that North Star or Southern
mm,
Cross, allows us to be far more adaptable because we
mm,
can always then say, and how can I learn in this environment? What do I need to learn? How
mm.
can I continue to do the things that I want now that the rules have changed or the
Yeah.
context has changed?
Wow. Wow. And I think it's becoming more and more important today as the rules of the game are changing. The rules of the way people show up in the organizations,
Yeah.
that's changing. And specifically after COVID, right? The post-COVID era is very, very different. People are 50% of the people are working from home, 50% are working in the hybrid environment. There are phenomena like quiet quitting. We have got great recession. The world is moving at a very different pace. Gary, I'm just wondering, two questions here. Let's start with the first question. What planted that seed for you to write a book on the next rules of work?
So it's a big part of the work that I've done through the years. I fell into high tech, and then
Mm,
for a while was the editorial head of six different technology magazines, and
mm,
then my wife was our managing partner for our business, and I produced these strategic conferences and events
mm.
and gatherings, and
Wow.
we did a lot of work with Singularity University, which is a global sort of platform of
Yes.
experts on exponential technologies. And what ended up happening over and over again is the topic of the future of work, the future of learning, and the future of the organization kept coming up. And I just lectured and wrote more and more on
Mm,
those issues. And then my wife and I, she produced a conference on the future of work in Detroit, Michigan, in the United
mm,
States, in late 2019. And she said two brilliant things. She said, the first is, we're not going to do any in-person events in 2020. And you may remember there was this virus that was just
mm.
about to
Yeah.
arrive. So she was prescient. And then the other thing that she did is she said, listen, I have reserved an Airbnb down in Monterey, California, and you're going to spend a month because
Mm,
you have a book inside of you.
mm. Wow. That's how it all
And so
started.
I wrote 100,000 words in a month,
Mm,
and that eventually coalesced into the next rules of work. And
mm,
what I wanted to do was to help people to have a framing,
mm.
because I talked about you talked about the pace of change. The other thing that is influencing our lives is the scale of
The
change.
scale of change.
Suddenly, I mean, the pandemic came on with breathtaking speed. Suddenly it's everywhere, but it's affecting almost everyone. I mean, it's just
Mm,
it's that this breathtaking reach in the modern world. And then along comes this what I call the artificial intelligence tsunami.
mm.
Along comes something called Chat GPT,
Yeah.
and suddenly 100 million people are using it in two
Mm,
months. So
yeah.
it's not just the speed, it's the scale. And
Mm,
so because of those different influences,
mm,
what I wanted people to feel like you had a structure, an approach. And so that's why I talk about mindset, skill set, and tool set. So that
Toolset.
was the real
Mm,
impetus, was to understand that these are sort of three legs of the stool. in how each of us as individuals, how
mm,
we navigate a world of exponential change,
mm,
how we do that as teams, and how we do that as organizations and communities.
mm,
So I
mm,
continually try to help people in each of those different contexts to
mm,
understand what is the most effective mindset, what helps you the
mm,
most, what's
mm,
the skill set we all need to continue to develop if we're going to be lifelong learners, and
mm,
then what's the tool set? Like, what are the techniques and the technologies that power us to be able to solve the next
mm,
problem?
mm. So let's double click on the stool that you spoke about, the mindset, the skill set, and the tool set. But before we get there, help me understand, since you work with few of the brightest brains in the world by the virtue of your association with Singularity University and the kind of work that Peter Diamandis is doing, I think it's path breaking, right? And I was just talking to a few of my friends a few days back. I think there's this gentleman I was talking about, Peter. I said he's probably one of the most powerful people, one of the most powerful person today walking on earth because of the sheer connection that he has been able to build in all these years. And these people are talking about longevity. These people are talking about AI, not right now. They've been talking about that for the last so many years.
Yeah,
Help
yeah.
me understand. Singularity University does a lot of work in the space of exponential technologies as well. What is it that common people like me are not aware of that we should be aware of? That is, hey, take a pause, wake up. The direction that we are marching ahead as humanity, this is where we are moving towards.
Okay. So first off, Gaurav, I'm going to guarantee you're not an average person. So I'm going to say that's I personally believe every single human being on the planet is unique, has a unique mix of skills, interests, history, all those sorts of things. And one of my curiosities is always to find out what that is. But I'd say for many people, there's a great line by the science fiction author Bruce Sterling.
Mhm.
The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Mm, mm,
And the
beautiful.
example that I
Mm,
use is I'm in San Francisco, and there's a street near me called Steiner Street, and it has been a test bed
mm,
for self-driving cars for 3 years. So both Waymo, the Google subsidiary, and one called Cruise, they are cruising past my house. I've got a picture of four of them that moved in a pack. My wife's coffee shop is a block from here, and
mm,
I've got a picture that I use in my talks of four driverless cars moving like a wolf pack
mm,
around
mm,
the
mm.
streets of San Francisco. And so I tell this to audiences, and they say, "What's a self-driving car?" It's like
Yeah.
the future's already here, but it's not evenly distributed. Some of
Mm,
us, it's right here, and others don't even see the slightest impact of it.
yeah.
So the Nordic countries have a great phrase:
Mm,
same storm, different boats.
yeah.
So each of us is in a different context. We have a
Yeah.
different exposure to things that are going on. And so, what Singularity University was started over a dozen years ago by Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil, who are each old friends of mine. And what they wanted to do was to bring together a group of very, very smart people around the world that are each experts on these technologies that are affecting our lives so much.
Mm,
And I think what ends up happening is what Ray has pointed out for years is that exponential curves uh, all look the same. At the beginning, you never heard of self-driving cars,
yeah.
and then suddenly there's this little. You start to see headlines about them, and then suddenly in San Francisco, they're everywhere.
Mm,
And sure, it took a couple of years, but now I always say all the time, if I had told you 15 years ago there was going to be a thing
mm,
and you were going to never leave your home without the thing.
mm,
You'd leave your keys or your wallet, but you'd always have the thing.
yeah.
And then you were going to open the thing and you were going to hit a virtual button and a
Yeah.
stranger's car was going to pull up and you were going
Yeah.
to say, Gaurav, and he's going to say, Gary, and didn't your mother tell you not to get into a stranger's car?
Yeah.
You're going to get into a stranger's car
Yeah.
and you would never exchange any money when you got it at the other end. If I told you 15 years ago you would do that, you'd say, you're crazy. I don't want the thing. I don't want any piece of technology that I
Mm,
can't leave my home without.
mm,
And I'm not going to get in a stranger's car. And yet here we're
yeah.
doing these. So
Yeah.
this is what I think, what I would, so one of the insights I get from talking to these many experts.
Yeah.
The first is that there's an exponential curve that our human minds, we are very linear.
Hmm.
And so there's a delta between what we think is going to happen. If you think of the initial days of the pandemic, many of us thought, oh, we'll be back in the office next week or
Hmm.
the following week. And in some places, it was 2 years later
Hmm.
that we started to get back together again. And so there's a delta. That's the first insight. The second is that these technologies all accelerate each other.
Hmm.
You get a self-driving car because of advances in artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
advances in lidar and other sensors, and so along comes a wave like the AI tsunami. And what it's important, I think, for everybody to realize is that we now have an infrastructure in place called the internet that allows things to happen on internet time, or as I'm fond of saying now,
Hmm.
on AI time, on artificial intelligence time. And we're not going to go back. And so we're going to see these technologies infused into more and more of our lives.
Precisely.
It can get overwhelming for people. It can
Hmm.
feel like too much change. We haven't even recovered from a pandemic, and now
Hmm.
we've got this next wave. And what I then urge everybody to be thinking about is, how do you do the self-care thing? How do you care for the people around you? How do you make
Hmm.
sure that we're all focusing that each of us can thrive in this
Hmm.
environment? We have to be more intentional, not less, in an era of exponential change.
Hmm. Beautiful. On one hand, we are talking about self-care. We are talking about care for others. On the other hand, we are talking about exponential change. We are talking about exponential technologies. We are talking about the pace at which and the scale at which the change is going to happen. How can we
Yeah.
integrate these two?
Again, the combination of the future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed, and same storm, different boats, right?
Hmm.
So for each of us, what we need is a process by which we determine how what it is that helps us, each of us as individuals, to be able to continually navigate a world of exponential change.
Hmm.
And for some people, the AI tsunami means nothing. If you are delivering food to a table in a restaurant, if you are digging a ditch for a construction crew, these mean nothing to you. If you are answering phones in a call center, it's going to mean a lot to you because those technologies are going to be used hopefully to
Precisely.
augment what you're doing, or they might be used to replace what you're doing. And so, what I would urge people is to be able to do a couple of things. The first is continually have a process by which you take a breath, you take a time, you establish a context to stop the noise and stop the
Hmm.
pace, to disconnect yourself from it. Because I tell young people all the time, is like, okay, just put the phone down. Now, could you do that for a day? Could you not touch it for a day? Could you not touch
Hmm.
it for a week? Could you not? Well, no, that cuts me off from my friends. Like, well,
Yeah.
then how do you turn off the noise level? How do
Hmm.
you and how do you double down and reconnect at a human level with other people without the technology as an interpreter, as a connector?
Hmm.
And so that's the first one, is how do you get the breath? The second is, in this era, what is critical is self-knowledge. Why do we do what we do? Why do we make the decisions that we make? Why do we
Hmm.
keep running into the same problem over and over again? Why
Hmm.
do we is over and over again date somebody and then we're not dating them anymore? Why does that happen? So it's the understanding of our own motivations, of our own process of solving problems. That's the second thing. And whatever, my father had a process called the flower, 7 different exercises you would do to re-envision your career. Maybe
Hmm.
that's an entry point. There are tools like strengths finders, whatever it is that helps you to do that self inventory. What do I
Hmm.
like to do? What's the kinds of problems I like to solve? What kinds of people do I like to work around? On my website, gbolles.com, I've got something called the Aristotle Canvas, which is a 1 pager to do that self inventory on. Whatever
Hmm.
you go through, try to have that process regularly. Maybe some people it's once a year,
Yeah.
do that self inventory. And then the third is to continually recalibrate
Hmm.
to establish your North Star or Southern Cross.
Yeah.
What is it that draws you? My friend John Hagel calls that pull. It's not push. What pulls you?
Yeah.
into the future? What pulls you into your next step? You started by asking questions about curiosity.
Mm,
If that is what pulls you into what's next for you, just know that that is your driver. That is
mm,
what gives you meaning in your life, and double down on that.
mm. Beautiful. I was just going through some work that you have done, and it took me the piece that you wrote in March 2020 around COVID pandemic, great reset. When the world was talking about pause, you were talking about hitting a reset button. And while I'm listening to you right now, a lot of questions are coming to me. They can just take one step backwards and revisit what we were talking about. On one hand, we are talking about exponential changes. On the other hand, we are talking about resetting ourselves and taking a pause and letting go of our mobile phone and revisiting our North Star. I'll come to this point. Gary, help me understand. As I mentioned, you have the access to a few of the best brains in the world. What, according to you, is the difference between people who actually creates breakthroughs, who come up with ideas that might not be applicable today, that might be the need of the hour a decade from now? So on one hand, those kind of brains. On the other hand, there are people who just love copying the best ideas, right? If they are doing something, let me also do this thing.
Yeah.
What's the difference in the mindset that you have been able to decipher for yourself, if you may? I love the smile on your face.
So no, because you ask great questions. First off, I think it's important to think of any society, any culture as an ecosystem, right? So you go into a rainforest, and there are different organisms, and they occupy different niches, and they
Mm,
perform different functions. And if a forest fire sweeps through a rainforest and it wipes out something that was in one of the niches, something has to come in and fill it.
mm,
In New Zealand, where one of my favorite places in the world, where I've spent my family and I've spent a lot of time, they don't have any mammals, no native mammals, just anything that could fly there. um, so they're all birds, and the birds evolved over time to fill all the niches. There
mm,
was an 8 foot tall predator bird that was like the lion of New Zealand, and there's the little pudgy bird that's like the koala called the kiwi. So they
mm,
filled all the niches because that's what these ecosystems require. There's
mm,
places to fill in. So my first answer is an ecosystem is breakthrough ideas. There are people that are continually thinking about how can I take a need or look at a problem, and how can I come up with a completely different way of solving it. So as many challenges as Uber, for instance, has brought into the world. Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, the problem he was trying to solve was not to just make better
mm,
companies. He used the Silicon Valley mindset of routing around the existing problem and coming up with a completely new way of
mm,
convincing us that we should be getting in the car of strangers.
mm,
And so that's one of the characteristics of the
mm,
people that are bringing breakthrough ideas is there's a problem they want to solve, and the traditional way either doesn't work for them or they think there's a better way.
mm,
There's a wonderful brainiac by the name of Pablos Holman, who's a good friend of ours,
mm,
and I encourage people to Google his name. My wife produced a YouTube show for Google for their science fair program, and had a young person interview him, and
mm,
he's a very famous hacker. And he said, so the example I use with problem solving is a user looks at the cell phone and says, "What can it do?" A hacker looks at it and says, "What can I make it do?"
mm,
So those breakthrough ideas are coming from people who often see an existing problem or a new problem and an existing solution and decide, no, 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 that's not the way to do it.
mm,
What is the new way I could do it? Or what is the way I could completely reshape the way
mm,
it's being done now and put it in service of that new idea? But the reason I talked about ecosystems is that societies need those ideators, they need those brainiacs doing the breakthrough ideas,
mm,
but they need the popularizers. They
Hmm.
need the fast followers. They need the slow followers.
Hmm.
Ecosystems require that because there always are going to be different mindsets. There are some
Hmm.
change junkies who always want the next and new thing, but there are people with a fixed mindset that don't want to change very often.
Hmm.
You know, when the internet, this thing called the internet was first starting 30 years ago, I
Hmm.
used to do talks and I would say, you will someday be emailing your grandmother.
Hmm.
And people would literally say, why would my grandmother want to email? I mean,
Hmm.
but wouldn't even ever understand technology and what,
Correct.
well, you know, but here we are, we're all emailing our grandmothers nowadays. So this is what's different, I think, is you need to have people with the breakthrough ideas. You need the fast followers. You need the ones that are the popularizers. You need the users. You need all of those in an ecosystem.
Hmm.
What happens is there are places where that are optimized
Hmm.
for the change junkies, the problem solvers, the ones that want to route around the existing problem. We call one of those places Silicon Valley, where I live, but there's plenty of other valleys around the
Yeah.
world that draw those people as well. And that's part of what you need in these ecosystems is where those ideas get supported and then others will take them and run with them.
Precisely. Thank you. Gary, help me understand. What are you fascinated about these days? What do you think? What are those areas that you would want to see breakthrough ideas coming in the next one, two,
No,
three,
good
4 years?
question. All right. So one of the things I'm passionate about for decades, but I think that the need is increasing,
Hmm.
is everything we do as humans to double down on what makes us human,
Hmm.
what keeps us human, is one of the most critical things that we need to focus on today.
Hmm.
You asked me to make some projections, like, you know, about technology and that sort of thing. I'm not a good predictor. I don't, even though my title with Singularity University is Chair for the Future of Work, I don't call myself a futurist. I don't think that way. I think
Hmm.
in terms of scenarios. But what I believe is there are scenarios
Hmm.
where our technology just becomes more and more part of our lives, where
Hmm.
we all have AI assistants, where we all use technology to communicate more and more with each other as opposed to communicating
Hmm.
directly. And we need a countervailing set of processes where each of us is doubling down on our
Hmm.
humanity. We need to teach our young people how to build these social and emotional learning skills of interacting directly with other humans
Hmm.
and not pushing the technology between us. And that sounds too
Hmm.
simple, like
Hmm.
oversimplified. But I see so many of the trends that are affecting us with technology
Hmm.
dissipating that. I see trends that we're less connected to our families. We're not as often
Hmm.
in multi generational homes. We're not as connected to our communities. And we need the countervailing processes where we double down on humanity because the technologists will keep on providing us with new ways to
Hmm.
use the technology to
Precisely.
put between us.
Yeah. And this is really fascinating because I was not even expecting that from you. I was expecting that you will tell me that we can have breakthrough ideas in this technology or in this
Yeah.
healthcare or um, in this
That that
or
that'll all happen.
yeah.
That'll all happen. Doesn't
The
need me.
interesting thing is, on one hand, we are talking about artificial intelligence, we are talking about blockchain, we are talking about um, the different exponential technology. But here, the answer that comes from you is we need to make more progress towards humanity. And I think that's becoming more and more important because all these innovations and breakthrough ideas are creating more distance between human beings. And
They,
I
they
think it's
can. I say they can create more distance. They also allow us to remain more connected and aware of
mm,
what's going on, and that's
yeah,
awesome. We need to accentuate those positive aspects, and we need to stop a lot of the more toxic aspects.
yeah. Gary, coming back to where we started our conversation, when I asked you that question, the initial conversation that you had with your father, when according to you, you were directionless. And here you are. I'm just wondering if you were not directionless, what kind of space that you would have created for yourself. If today, um, if you get an opportunity to have a conversation with your father, what would you convey him?
So no,
What would
excellent
you?
question.
Yeah.
So my father passed away 6 years ago, and we had a marvelous relationship. We started eParachute, our software company, together, and I refer to and talk a lot about his work as often as I possibly can because he created this amazing body of work. What I miss is our conversations to be able to take his framing because he was always focused on what works for humans, like what
Mm,
helps people to be able to have the lives that they want. And what I miss most is to be as I have the gift of talking to people all around the world. I mean, here we are having a marvelous conversation, and I talk to people in a countless number of countries, and I get to go and see them in person and hear from people from doing the range of doing workshops for refugee youth in Amman, Jordan, and Maori youth in New Zealand, all the way to sitting down with ministers of labor and education in countries from Brazil to Tunisia. So I get this incredible breadth. What I miss is my father's very simple way of distilling things down to what it is that humans need to go through, these pivot points, especially in their lives, and to continually sort of build the connection between what they most want to do and the kind of work that they're doing, and try to make as much of a
mm,
overlapped Venn diagram as possible. And
mm,
I miss his wisdom to be able to help people in this era, because I think we're just going to need more like him that
mm,
can help every human to be able to come up with that answer for what it is that is their North Star or Southern Cross. That curiosity you were talking about, I believe every human needs that. And we need more people like him to help
mm,
people to figure that out.
mm. So you said, I miss this and I miss the wisdom, I miss the humanity part of him. Would you convey that to him? That, Dad, you know what? This is
Oh
what I
yeah,
miss in you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, no. Listen, the gift that I had, I don't know if others have seen this, but when you're young, the age gap between your parents seems,
Huge.
it's a gulf. And then what ends up
Yeah.
happening over time is, oh, you know what?
Yeah.
It's not that big. Like,
Mm.
I've
Absolutely.
I've I've
Yes.
I've known you on this planet for longer, than the distance between our ages. So yes, that was a great gift in later years. Is like
Yeah.
not trying to workshop that as much.
Yeah.
You're getting closer in a lot of ways.
As I often share, that we are just the extensions of our parents.
Yeah, yeah,
So thank you so much, Gary. What a
yeah.
beautiful conversation it was. Thank you so much for
Absolutely.
your time and absolute
No,
delight to have you.
no, no. Wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.